Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Talking Law from Women in the Law UK. I'm Sally Penny. I'm the founder of Women in the Law UK, an organisation which is passionate about supporting the next leaders in law. We put on regular events, seminars, masterclasses, and also enjoying an annual dinner, a conference. And so do come and learn more about what we do at womeninthelawuk.com. I'm also a barrister in Manchester at Kenworthy's Chambers and the joint vice chair of the Association of Women Barristers. On this month's episode, I'm thrilled to speak to Baroness Helena Kennedy QC of the Shores. We started by talking about her long career.
Oh, listen, I've been a barrister since 1972.
Wow.
So we're talking about 48 years. We're talking about, I'm a real old bird,
Well,
so.
You're not. You're wearing a fabulous jacket, some wonderful pearls. They look like an old bird to me.
Yeah.
But that's amazing.
Well, I qualified when I was 22. So, there we are. I qualified at a time when there were very, very few women at the bar. It was 6%. That was 6 out of 100.
Is that all?
Yeah, and went into practice. I mean, the qualifying was maybe about 9%, but quite a lot of women, married or whatever, and just didn't even do pupillage. What made me even rarer at that time was that I was from a working class background. I was from very, very different background from most of I think, certainly all of the women that were studying with me, around that time. I came from Glasgow. I was from a working class family, brought up in a tenement until I was 11 and then in a council house. I went to the local schools, Catholic schools. We were very much part of the Catholic community in Glasgow. And so, we were not well-off people. We were people who, my father had periods of unemployment, and I remember as a child, those difficult times.
Yes.
But my mother did waitressing and things to kind of cover the bills. But my parents were thoroughly decent, good people, and they had a strong sense of social responsibility and giving something back, and they were very good Catholics and not dogmatic.
Yes.
I look back on it and I think they were really fine people. My father was in his trade union, and a lot of that was about industrial injuries and things happening to people which would have left them very hard up if there hadn't been a strong union to advocate their cases. And so I became very aware of the whole sort of social circumstances which meant that people's lives could suddenly be stricken.
Yes.
And I was good at debating at school.
Yes, I was going to say.
And I enjoyed that. It was very much part of the Scottish tradition that you debated, and I remember I did Latin and Greek at school. I was pretty clever. And so, and Mr. Lavelle, who taught us classics, it was a mixed school, boys and girls, Catholic state school. And I remember, him, he really brought me on as a debater from when I was about probably 12. And I remember him saying, you'll be on the side of, the death penalty, and you, John Brown, will be on the side against the death penalty. And I was saying, no, I'm against the death penalty. And because of course you've got to remember, this was in the 60s, the early 60s.
Oh,
and so,
yes,
it was the very time when, the death penalty was ending, where they were putting legislation through. And my family were against the death penalty. And so I'd heard my parents discussing it. And so I wanted to be on that side. And he said, no, debating's about learning how to put your feet into the shoes of other people.
Yes.
And so in a way it was a preparation for being a lawyer.
Yeah.
The subject I truly loved at school was English. I loved English and history, and I was pretty much a humanities person from the off.
Yes.
And I thought I would go to university to do English, because I imagined the idea of being able to just read all those books that I desperately wanted to read. But I was diverted into doing law.
Yes, I was going to say, why law?
Well, what happened was, I always tell the story about the fact that I certainly was aware from my father talking about industrial injuries and so on, about how ordinary folk just were, had difficulties in getting good lawyering. But I also was aware that once my mother suffered an injury, where we lived in a poor area, which when we moved up to Pollokshaws, I'm Baroness Kennedy of the Shaws.
Oh, I see.
Yes, it's part of the place where we're from. Well, at that time there were a lot of very old houses and stuff, and my mother had her head split open by a slate that fell off a building that was neglected. It almost blinded her, and she had. I remember people saying to her, "May, you should go to some lawyers because they shouldn't have let that building be in that state," and so forth. And my mother, who was a doughty woman. I mean, she wasn't frightened of many things, but she said, "I don't want to. They'll charge us a lot of money, and we haven't got the money to pay for a solicitor." Oh. And she was frightened to even go there, and she had to be persuaded to go to a solicitor, and that stayed with me. That idea that for many people, the idea of engaging with law is just so not open to them. It's not something they would instinctively think of doing, and the cost is a serious consideration. And my God, we should think about it now as legal aid has been decimated.
Yes.
But I came down and got a summer job when I was 17. I came to London and I worked for the summer holidays, and I worked in an employment agency. I saw the ad in the newspapers, and I was a Girl Friday in an employment agency in the city. And you don't have Girl Fridays nowadays, but I used to basically be a sort of runner and getting people lunches and things, and then I used to be answering phones and all of that. And I became friendly with some students who had holiday jobs, and some of them were guys who did sort of office work like filing and so that sort of thing, and a number of them were students who were at the London School of Economics. And you've got to remember, you might not remember because you're too young, and many of your listeners will be too, but at this time, 1968 was a very important time. The Vietnam War was going on. Students around the globe were actually very upset at the idea that we might be, at risk of falling into yet more wars. Our parents had fought in the Second World War, my father had, and so we were very much against the idea of war. We were also very much against the idea of making decisions for people rather than leaving nations to decide for themselves what kind of systems they wanted.
Yes.
And so we were all kind of against the Vietnam War, and certainly at school we were against the Vietnam War. And so I met these students who were sort of all studying, and they were at university, and they were politically aware, and I thought, I want to be part of that. One of the boys was studying law, and I remember thinking, that does sound like something I ought to be doing, where I can make a difference to society. And so that was why I made the choice. And I think it's very interesting nowadays, because I often have these conversations, most of us choosing to do law. Of course there's a business about being someone in a profession, and that's very appealing, and the kind of, if you like, security and the status and all the good things that come with that, and hopefully being well paid, although too many are not well enough paid nowadays, and people don't realise that. But I wasn't interested in the money or a status or anything. I wanted to make a difference, and I think that most people choosing law, they know that good law makes for good societies, and good legal systems make for decent societies, and they come in with good intentions.
Yes.
And I don't want lawyering to be seen as being just a business.
Yeah.
I want it to have that sense in which it's a vocation, and that we're contributing to something bigger.
Yes.
And even if it's in a small way, that's our purpose in becoming lawyers.
That is such a brilliant summary, because I really applaud that. What do you think about people wanting to study law, practice law, as you did?
For me, coming into the law was really a vocation. I wanted to make a difference to society. I wanted to be acting for people who had little voice within the legal system. And even if people become commercial lawyers, I do believe that for the majority of people becoming lawyers, it's because they do want to make a difference, and they do recognise the importance of law as being one of the fundamental aspects of a society, and that adherence to the rule of law is so important that most of us become lawyers, not just to become business people, and making money, but actually because we want to make that contribution. And we have to constantly remind the world of that, and to remind lawyers of that they're more than businessmen and women. They're actually contributing to something bigger, and that we have to keep that sense that we're in a part of a vocation, part of a profession, where ethics of the highest standards are so vital, yes. Our willingness to represent people who sometimes are abhorred by the rest of society. We have to keep reminding people that being a lawyer is not about just being a business person.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you. And for you, as a feminist, because you've written some wonderful books which we've all enjoyed. We read one of your books, your recent book, about whether or not British justice is not against women, but
does it deliver for women? I mean, it's a
yes.
kind of obvious thing, but when I started seeing this back in the 70s, it wasn't obvious, and what I was saying was, who made law? And basically, our institutions, our nations have been run by men.
Yes.
And the nature of our world was that power was in the hands of men, and those who made law, made decisions about what the rules of society were the guys. And the absence of women from lawmaking has meant that law often doesn't deliver for women. And so even now, when we're increasing the numbers of women within systems, within
yes.
institutions,
yes.
unfortunately, they're often not in the places where law is being made, and often we've not been challenging the nature of law itself,
yes.
because sometimes it's the actual law, the black letter law, that fails women because it's been drawn in a way that was reflecting men's lives and not the lives and reality of for women. I mean, the most obvious example for me was around issues to do with self-defense,
yes.
In domestic violence or in any circumstances of sexual violence like rape. Well, somehow there was this expectation that people would fight like a lion, defending their honor, or that women could walk away or leave the home if they were being battered. And you would hear judges saying, and prosecutors saying, well, why didn't she leave if it was so terrible?
Yeah.
And so the assumption was it was being exaggerated.
Yes.
When in fact, you've got to look at were the rules made with women in mind? Were they made recognising the kind of, if you like, the power balance within relationships,
yes.
and within sexual intimacy, how often that might go awry, and who are making the decisions as to how it should be?
Yeah.
All of that stuff. And when I started practicing at the bar back in the 70s, I knew class stuff. I knew what it was like to be a girl from a working class family, and I knew the problems that confronted working class people.
Yeah.
My mother was someone that people came to with their problems. My father was a trade unionist. He worked in newspapers, dispatching as a dispatch hand,
yes.
getting newspapers distributed around the country. And so they were people who kind of did things for other people. And so I knew how things were around class, and I had a fairly strong political sense about how class operated in our society and who did not have power.
Yes.
But I also learned suddenly, because it was that moment, was how women's lives were affected by a system which disempowered women.
Yeah.
And, I became a feminist at a time when there was that second wave of feminism where suddenly we were shining the spotlight on this. And we've got to remember why that was. It was because in the United States, there had been the civil rights movement in the 60s. Of course, it grew out of a long period of challenging to slavery and so
yes.
forth. But the fact that there was still a kind of apartheid in America, and that black people were second-class citizens, and the civil rights movement, led by people like Martin Luther King,
yeah.
but by white progressive people, joined in to say this has to stop,
yes.
and recognising their privilege. so then women started saying, hey, hold on, what about us?
Yeah.
In a similar way that black people have been treated as second-class citizens, women too are kept in subordinate positions.
Absolutely.
And so that gave rise to a lot of the change that we now are still grappling with, but we've seen a huge difference. And the same thing happened, of course, in Northern Ireland. Catholics in the community in Northern Ireland started saying, hold on, we're also second-class citizens here.
Yeah.
And so you got the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. And so there was an unleashing of that around the world, of people saying, we've been colonised. Imperialism has placed us in a secondary position. And so there was more and more of this voice rising saying, we demand to be treated in our humanity, to be absolutely recognised in the dignity of us as individuals. And although the Declaration of Human Rights had happened after the Second World War, it was really in the 60s and then into the 70s that organisations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch took sort of roots amongst young people wanting a different world.
Yes.
And so I was part of that generation. And so I wanted to be a lawyer who was involved in those things.
Yes.
And so I started looking at how does the law deliver for women? And I, of course, often went to court for women, shoplifting in Marks and Spencer or something. And you started looking at the lives that had and the circumstances that had driven women to these things.
Yeah.
And so I then started writing about that, and I also started looking at how the profession itself was so discriminatory against women.
Yes.
Chambers said quite clearly, we don't take women. Or once the Sex Discrimination Act came in, people didn't say it so loudly. It's like
what did they do? Because I remember on a previous podcast with Dame Laura Cox, she talked a lot about this.
Yeah, it was so interesting. Laura's of a similar generation to me. Well, first of all, the Sex Discrimination Act made it clear that you couldn't be saying we don't take women, which of course they had done up until then. When I was looking for a pupillage, they were saying we don't take women. It was very hard for me to get a pupillage. And of course women, most of my friends, of the women, my friend Hilary Heilbronn or whatever, they came from different kinds of backgrounds. Absolutely. Where they had connections.
Yes.
And Hilary and I have discussed it recently. I didn't have those connections. I wasn't from that kind of background where with anybody in the law who was connected. So I had to really bludgeon some poor man into taking me as his pupil, and he warned me that I wouldn't have an easy time, and I didn't. And so we ended up. It was very interesting because they then had to not discriminate, but they would say to people, "Are you engaged? Are you planning to get married?" Or whatever. And so they would, in interviews, apparently they used to ask people that. I didn't have that experience myself, but I knew women who had. And it was interesting. The women who had succeeded often made great sacrifices, remaining childless or remaining single or whatever. And Chambers liked that. That was fine. They wanted what they called spinsters. The spinster successful woman lawyer. Or women often that sent their children off to boarding school very, very young. The very privileged women that I knew who were older than me. Yes. The way they'd managed was that their children had gone away to school.
So how did you manage them? Because you've got 3 children and you were married.
But I didn't have my children until I was in my 30s.
Right.
And so I had 3 of them. I was 33, 36, 39. Yeah, how's that for planning?
I know.
Anyway, and so and the thing about that was that by that time I was doing rather well. I was doing big trials and so on. I was earning decent money. I married a guy who was a doctor. So between us, we were earning decent money and could afford decent childcare. Yeah. So that is about being privileged. And I don't pretend that it wasn't because of being older and earning decent money. And there are women now who are struggling because legal aid has been decimated.
Absolutely.
And it's not right that people who have spent years learning their trade, learning their skills, shouldn't be paid properly.
Yeah.
But to go back to the business of what happened with Chambers, when I finished my pupillage, there was no question that I was going to be taken on by the chambers. They didn't want women, and the clerks in chambers had a lot of power because they got 10% of the earnings of their barristers, and so they didn't put opportunities in the way of women.
Yeah.
And so I looked around, and with some friends, we decided to set up a new set of chambers, which was a pretty.
It was revolutionary.
It was revolutionary, actually, and I feel that I should actually write about this because there were 6 of us, 3 men and 3 women, and one of the women was a gay woman who was an out gay woman, which was pretty rare in those days.
She was
a lesbian, and she was
crikey.
openly a lesbian and didn't make any secret of it. And we very actively made it clear that we were very keen that we should be joined by people who were from racial minorities and so forth. And so it was a set of chambers which is now Garden Court.
Yes.
And it started off as stone buildings, and we had a little annex. And it happened because I pinched the little card that was in a notice board on Middle Temple Lane saying rooms available in Lincoln's Inn, suitable for annex, apply here, and so I whipped off the notice board. I moved the glass along, pulled it out, and so we were the only applicants for the rooms, and we got a junior clerk from a set of chambers, but we made the revolutionary change in that we paid him a salary. We did not let him. We
have the sort of percentage that existed.
Right. We didn't. So we said no, and the reason we said no was because we knew that, but it put too much power. If you're getting a percentage of somebody's income, then you're going to choose people that you think are going to be earning, and so they always chose posh young men.
Yes.
And so we paid him a salary. And of course, it also provided him with security.
Yes, of course.
And then we slowly grew, and we moved to Fetter Building in Inner Temple. Then we moved to Garden Court, and now Garden Court exists as a huge set of chambers in Lincoln's Inn,
and an annex in the north in Manchester.
That's right. and so that came out of that moment of saying, we are different, and we were people who also wanted to do work that was often not very well treated by clerks in sets of chambers. We wanted to represent juvenile offenders. We wanted to represent the law centres, which were just opening up at the time.
Yes.
We wanted to act for legal aid firms in places like Hackney or up in Kilburn or parts of London, which were really working class areas then. Now there's no area that's working class in London. And then we also did a lot of work for Chiswick Women's Aid, which was the first refuge for women who were battered.
Wow.
And we started doing that work for those women. And so we were in at the beginning of the community law centre movement, of the refuge movement, and we started doing all of that work. Now, I earned very little money. I lived hand to mouth, but I really learned my craft. And it was wonderful. And I then did a lot of public order cases because there were lots of demonstrations. We saw the rise of the National Front at that time.
Yes, yeah.
And a lot of cases involving racism. We did lots of cases around, basically where people were demonstrating against insidious things that were happening in society.
Absolutely.
And so we that was how our work was. And then I became pretty well known as a civil liberties lawyer. I used to volunteer for the National Council of Civil Liberties and for different organisations. And then
you did some high-profile cases.
Well, I started then. I moved into doing quite a lot of the Irish cases.
Right.
By the time I was in my late 20s, I was doing some of the Irish cases as a junior barrister, to being led by more senior lawyers. And I worked a lot with Michael Mansfield, who wasn't in our chambers. He was in Cloisters, but he and I worked a lot together. And then I became someone who became recognised as a lawyer who was good at dealing with high-level terrorist cases. And I then did them not just in the Irish circumstances, because it came out of the Irish Troubles, but also I did work on the Middle East, involving Palestinians who went on trial, and we did some cases involved. I mean, I eventually did the bombing of the Israeli embassy, but I did the Guildford 4 appeal and the Balcombe Street siege, and so we did a whole range range of high-level work. And then after 19 years practice, I became a QC.
A QC, wow. Well,
but I was always I was involved in the setting up of 3 different new sets of chambers.
Yes, because
the second one was Tooke's Court, which I did with Mike Mansfield, because I co-defended with him a lot in Irish cases. We became good friends. He then said he wanted to set up a new set of chambers and asked if I would join with him, and I did. And we brought Len Woodley, who was the first black QC at the bar, joined us, and we had a lot of young black lawyers came into as when we set up, and it was really to break this logjam, which was that black lawyers were having a very difficult time, and basically, they were having to set up sets of chambers where everybody was black.
Yes,
and
so more. I hate this term, but ghetto chambers.
Yeah, because traditional sets of chambers that had existed forever were not welcoming to black applicants. And why would you want to go somewhere where you didn't see any other black people?
Yes.
So we really developed Tooke's Court, and I was there for a number of years. And then I really wanted to start doing more work in the international domain.
Yes.
And Jeff Robertson always did quite a lot of work in the international sphere. And he and others who were at Dr. Johnson's building were talking about setting up a new set of chambers. And I went to Dr. Johnson's building. I was there for about a year, and then we set up Doughty Street Chambers, which is where I still am.
Which is where you still are.
Yeah, that's right. So I've been involved. I like setting up new things.
Yes.
I like being creative about where you take the legal system next. And Doughty Street was very interesting because not only does it do a lot of international criminal work and things in international courts, but it also it was very modern in that it started saying, we hot desk before people did that. We also had a library and a librarian. We also brought in people who were researchers and had academics who belonged to our chambers in a quite a connected way.
Yes.
We also
which is very different to
and we had management. Instead of having a traditional clerking system, all of us paid salaries. But you'd get bonuses if things went well in a year. But we always paid salaries because we believed that you had to break this thing, which is, where your career could be affected by people by somebody thinking, well, she'll get this. I'll push this case in her direction because it'll get us a lot of money, rather than letting the barrister say, no, I'd rather choose a case that's not going to pay me well, but where I believe that the substance of it is so important.
Absolutely.
And so and we also had people, who we basically had a management team, and so it was much more professionalised, I think, in a modern way.
Absolutely.
And using new technology and things. And Doughty Street now is, I think, one of the well recognised human rights chambers that does human rights.
Totally. Yes. And you've got Tunde Akwala there, Amal Clooney, Keelan
Gallagher, who does wonderful,
Henrietta Hill, all these wonderful people,
and
women,
lots of women,
and lots of minorities, which I think is amazing, and that's down to that vision.
Well, we had a clear vision about what we wanted to do there, and it's fantastic, and it's great fun, and I love my colleagues, and I learn so much from them all the time, and I'm always hungry to keep on learning. But one of the things that I would say, and I would always say it when I'm talking to women coming into the law, is do other things.
Yes.
I mean, you're Sally doing other things because you're doing your broadcasting and stuff. But it's about doing other things.
Yes, I wonder if we can talk. Yeah,
enriches your practice. It makes you better. So? It makes you better at what you do. It means that you're also connecting with people who are not inside the law. You're not just with your own crowd.
Absolutely.
And so I was always interested in the arts, and I had lots of friends in the theatre who directed and did different things, and lots of actor friends. And so I ended up being on the board of the Hampstead Theatre when I was still quite comparatively young. From that I went on to being I chaired the London International Festival of Theatre, and then I ended up becoming the chair of the British Council around the world at the point when Labour went into government in 1997. But before that I had chaired Charter 88, which was a constitutional reform group where we were arguing that there should be a freedom of information Discrimination Act, where there should be a Human Rights Act, where there should be, Parliament should be reformed, and so on.
Brilliant.
And again, that was why I ended up in the House of Lords. And so other things open up to you when you do things outside of your own sort of safe space and your own particular cases. And so I always did other things.
Yes.
And so it has opened up doors for me, which I think have been important. And part of course, was that from the late 70s, I was very concerned about the position of women.
Yes.
And I championed that. And I went on to the Bar Council, being a pain in the ass. But at the time, I was considered very problematic and a boat rocker. And some of the people would say to me, stop rocking the boat, and, you know, women will get there in the end. And I said, not fast enough for me, pal. And I really think you sometimes have to stick with what you believe in and be principled about it. Yeah. And then it's become mainstream. I mean, now it's not unusual to talk about the law in the way that I talk about the law. No. But there was a time when I was considered a complete iconoclast. I used to appear on Women's Hour, and I used to do...
we enjoyed you being on there.
And I used to be invited to make television programmes which were around the law. And it's important that we talk about the law in ways that it doesn't turn it into some mystified subject.
Yes.
The law is about our lives. It's about the stuff that is about all of our human relationships with employers, with landlords, with our neighbours, with our lovers, with our partners in life. And so the law is everywhere. You know, some people would say it's too present, but it's about regulating relationships, both internationally and nationally. And so we've got to be able to put it into language that is accessible. And so I've always believed in talking about the law in a way that makes it readily available to everybody else. And so I started doing quite a bit of broadcasting, and then and occasionally writing articles in the press. And then I wrote Eve Was Framed. Yeah. And at the time, let me tell you, it was considered I
love that book.
I threw a hand grenade. It's now nearly 30 years ago.
I know. I think there's a new published cover.
Yes, that's right. And it was like I threw a hand grenade into the legal system, because judges came out saying, no, this is completely untrue, and we don't even notice that people are male or female, and we treat people equally and all that kind of thing. Well, I was actually saying, what does equally mean? You know, you actually have to look at the life of the person in front of you, and if you want to do justice, you have to contextualise. You know, there's no point in treating a woman the same as a man if she's the mother of 3 kids and she's been abandoned by their father, and she's the person that's having to try and make a life. Yes. And so you know, so much of that stuff has entered, as I say, into the mainstream, and now we're sort of, you know, having to keep pushing it up, because some of the changes that we thought would make the difference haven't.
Yes.
And also, we know that for women as professionals, the juggling is hard. The business that often it falls to women to be the people who kind of organise are the main carer. Yeah. And that has to be taken into account. And so we're often talking about trying to change the working environment so that it is better for people who are parents who look after their elderly relatives or whatever. Yeah. And the thing I love, though, is that now, you know, young men will say to me, I've got to get back home because, you know, the people who are my juniors in cases or whatever.
Yes.
So that's
which is
that's
brilliant.
Fantastic.
It really is. And does that make you think, all right, we have actually progressed?
Well, we've come a long way, undoubtedly. I mean, it pretends to say that we haven't. We just have more battles to fight.
Yes.
And it is terrible that domestic violence remains a blight in our lives. But let me tell you, Sally, I now am the director of the Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association.
Absolutely.
And you know, here it is. It's a it brings together bar associations from 180 countries around the world.
It's huge. It's
huge, and huge numbers of lawyers in it. And of course, many of those lawyers are commercial lawyers, but not all of them.
Yes.
And they're employment lawyers and lawyers and all. And you know, I'll go out to places, and domestic violence is a blight. There isn't a place in the world where women do not experience it. You know, of course, it happens the other way around occasionally, and so. But we're talking about the position of women in society and how we've still got a long way to go globally.
Yes.
And one of the wonderful things is that, I was just recently in Pakistan, and a young woman comes up to me and she said, "Do you recognise me?" And she's a woman who actually did some pupillage with me, and she now is out there, and she's a junior minister in the Ministry of Law and Justice. And we're now plotting the expansion of courts which are going to be courts specifically to deal with gender-based violence.
Well, that's amazing.
Then they'll be basically to deal with the problems that women face. Because, across Pakistan there's been real issues around, forcing women to marry the people who rape them, a failure to address violence against women.
Yes.
And so a lot of that has got to be about training prosecutors properly. And so the IBA, the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, is working with her on doing that. And we do that kind of work all over the world.
Right.
And we do incredible work training lawyers and judges about human rights. At this stage in my professional life, I'm rather liking that I'm getting the chance of, looking at systems rather than doing the individual case.
Absolutely.
Obviously, Khashoggi was an example of my being the legal expert on that. Of Jamal Khashoggi's murder at the hands of Saudi.
That's not the only high profile. I'm thinking Julian Assange and Mara Hindley.
I did act for Mara Hindley when she tried to escape from prison.
When she tried to escape,
yes. Yeah. I've done lots of really. My life in the law has been wonderful, and I thank God for the fact that I've had such opportunities, and I've experienced good things in my life. It hasn't been all plain sailing.
No,
but I've really loved my professional life. But I want other women to have that same joy, and young men too. Yes. But I want it to be different for them. Yeah. I want their struggles to be alleviated, because it's still we aren't there yet. No. I want to be an enabler of that kind of change, and so that's been part of my life's work.
And having impact. Helena, I want to ask you about work-life balance.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to ask about your favourite fictional lawyer. And the script that you wrote, Blind Justice, which is a fantastic production, if nobody's seen it.
You're all too young, you see. This was back in the 80s. I put together a drama series with a wonderful playwright, Peter Flannery, and it was a television series about, at the heart of it, a woman lawyer and her colleagues in a progressive set of chambers rather like the ones that I'd been in. It was fun doing that, and of course it was about terrorism and the difficulties of doing terrorist cases, and the hostility that there is from the get-go, and assumptions of guilt and so on, but also then the cases involving racism, cases involving violence towards women. Wow. And so it was a fun thing to do, and so it's made me look at drama as one of the ways in which you can really change attitudes. Yes. And often you can see things in drama and in creative writing that you can't do elsewhere. Yeah. But that was an interesting thing to do. Another interesting thing that I've loved doing is that I've been involved in higher education, further and higher education. I've been the Chancellor of a number of universities, yes. And I also was the head of an Oxford college.
Yes, Mansfield College.
I didn't have that kind of Oxbridge education, but all I can say is that going to Mansfield, which already had a very good record in providing opportunities for young people from state schools, and we drove it up. Where 92% of our young, the people who come to Mansfield College come from state schools up and down the country. It made me very proud that we did that. Yeah. And also while there, and being the head of the college, creating an Institute of Human Rights at Oxford, which had never had one. And so
it's fantastic. Absolutely. I went there last year. They invited
did you go
me
to
give
the
a speech.
Oh, fantastic.
They were wonderful. I met a girl from St. Helens.
They were
wonderful.
Quite a number of our young come from Liverpool and come from all over because we've got special links with state schools up and down the country. But I want to encourage people listening to know that it's a great place and a great place to do law. But the other thing I wanted to just mention is that we can, people get their inspiration from watching things on telly. Yeah. And so you were going to ask me about, lawyers that
well, your favourite fictional lawyer.
My favourite fictional lawyer.
And your favourite book.
I loved Maxine Peake in Silk. And I have to tell you...
Was it based on you?
No. No. All I can tell you is that Maxine Peake, I had the great joy of meeting Maxine and becoming friends with her, because we did a thing for charity, where I defended Lady Macbeth, and
was that in Gray's Inn?
It was in the Royal Courts of Justice, and Bob Marshall Andrews, another QC, represented Macbeth, and that was Matthew McFadyen, and lots of fabulous actors were in it. And Judge John Deeds was the judge, and Maxine was Lady Macbeth, and I did get an acquittal, and I got her off. Anyway, but it was great fun, and she came and spent time with me and so on. And at that time, the writer of Silk was already starting work with her on that. And so she and I had lots of conversations around the business of her playing that role. And I loved it, and I thought she was terrific in it. And she also encouraged lots of people to think, you can be a working class person and come into the law and make a success of it and make a difference to people's lives. And you can remain your own person, and you don't have to turn yourself into somersaults into becoming some sort of, person remote from your being and who you really are. And I've never tried to get rid of my Scots accent. I've not done that. And I've never ever not talked about the fact that I'm from a working class background. I am proud of the fact that of my background, and I think it made me aware of lots of things that perhaps the law needs to be conscious of. And so we need lawyers from as many different backgrounds as possible. And that's why sitting here with a gorgeous, wonderful black woman who's a barrister and a successful one is a great joy to me too. And that's the thing, is that the law needs to be enriched by people from many different backgrounds. And that's not to say that there aren't plenty of good middle class folk doing great things in the law too.
Absolutely.
But we just need all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And we will make the law serve our communities and the world better if we have that diversity.
Oh, what a great place to end on. But I've got two more questions.
Okay.
I just wondered what you do for, we're always pushing well-being, women shouldn't burn out, do too much. Have you got anything that you can do? Because you do so much. You're a great advocate. You sit all these great boards.
Sally, this morning I was at Pilates. I go to Pilates twice a week. I try to do yoga if I can over the weekend, if it's possible. But I now have 3 grandbabies.
Oh wow!
And so I like to get the chance of spending time with them. Yeah. We were yesterday playing Snap with our 4-year-old granddaughter, and
did you win?
Sometimes I win, and sometimes she wins. You can't always let the other little one win. They've got to know that sometimes losing is fine, and you have to do it with dignity.
Oh, amazing!
And and I love the theatre, and I go to the theatre a lot. In fact, I'm going to see Maxine Peake shortly in the Welkin, which is on at the National, which is about all women's juries.
Absolutely.
Back in the 17th century, and I've written a piece for the programme notes for that, and I'm a great reader of novels, and so I love reading novels.
Well, can I ask you then, because you've written a lot of novels, you write a lot. What's your favourite? Do you have a favourite book or
one
novel?
One of the great ones, of course, is it was as a kid was To Kill a Mockingbird, and it feeds on that idea of of fairness, of that justice comes out of that visceral thing that every human being has, which is about what is fair.
Absolutely.
But a book that I would recommend to everybody who cares about human rights and so on is, I love Philippe Sand's book East West Street, which is not a novel, but which is a lovely piece of history about his own family, beautifully written by a great human rights lawyer, but about how modern human rights came into being.
Yes.
I can think of many books, but I'm also an avid crime writing reader, and so and many of them, of course, nowadays involve lawyers.
Yes, they do. Baroness Helena Kennedy, I know you said just to call you Helena. Thank you so much for talking law. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Great fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for listening to Talking Law with me, Sally Penny. We'd love it if more people heard our podcast. So if you can spare just a couple of minutes to leave us a review, that will help people find us. Until the next episode, please do check in and see what we're up to at womeninthelawuk.com. You can find all the details of our latest networking events, masterclasses, conferences, and of course my book by the same title, Talking Law. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook at Women in the Law UK. And you can find us on our new LinkedIn page as well, Women in the Law UK, and our LinkedIn group, Women in the Law UK. We look forward to connecting with you. Bye for now.